Hey, I'm Brad. Welcome back to Overkill Rewind for my first time on the show where you vote for them and we review them. So we're going back 10 years to 2008. And I know that really isn't that long ago, but I'll give you a little bit of a refresher of what was going on in the world at that time. As far as movies, we had The Dark Knight coming out. There was a new Indiana Jones movie, the reboot of that original trilogy.
I bet you can squeal. I bet you can squeal like a pig.
There was WALL-E. As far as pop music goes, you might remember, I don't really care about that, so let's just talk about metal. So going back 10 years in metal, well, I had a harder job doing this than Martin and Sam did, where they did the 70s and 80s, when there was kind of more of a dominant thread through metal. In 2008, there really wasn't. It was kind of a lot of different subgenres and sub-subgenres all intermingling together. So there was just a lot to take in and a lot to talk about. When I got the tallied list of votes for the top 5 albums, I wasn't necessarily surprised. I mean, all of the albums I'm going to talk about are, definitely monoliths within the genre within that year. But it wasn't necessarily what I was listening to a lot at the time. So I knew that I had a lot of listening to do, a lot of deep dives to do on these bands to get the context for it. And I'm excited to share my opinions and what I found with you now. So let's check it out. First up at number 5, we've got Amon Amarth's Twilight of the Thunder Gods, which came out in September of 2008 on Metal Blade Records. It's worth mentioning that that song, the title track of the album, is actually their most popular song on Spotify to this day. This is Amon Amarth's 7th studio album, and it does a great job at showing off both sides of their sound. That song, the title track, as well as many other on the album, show off their energetic, blazing, melodic death metal. The other side of their sound exhibited here is more of like a groovier stomp. We all know that Amon Amarth sings about Vikings. They kind of look like Vikings. And this other side of their sound, it fits with Vikings. It kind of sounds like the music that, it's their stomp as they march into battle. Appropriately, the second most popular song on the band's Spotify is Guardians of Asgard, which really embodies that second side of their sound. So the fans have spoken. This is kind of the embodiment of the band's sound. They perfected it. They nailed it down. They sharpened their axe or sword or, what do Vikings use to kill people? Like, whatever. And you could kind of tell that they just got so good at doing what they were doing that every 2 to 3 years from here on out, they were going to be pumping out a similar album with slight variations, and everybody was going to be happy with it. If I were to think of a criticism for this album, it might be that it's almost too polished. They lost a little bit of their threat in the perfection that they accomplished here. But then again, you go tell a big Viking motherfucker that it's too polished. Fortunately for my health, I said that that's if there was a criticism. And I don't think it's a huge criticism because this is really the first time that they've achieved that level of polish. It's still kind of exciting. So because of that, this is the start of Amon Amarth's reign at the top. It's essentially a classic album for this band, and I'm going to have to give it 4 to 5 skulls. So the 4th album on this list is one of the more controversial ones. It's certainly going to get a lot of people arguing in the comments. It's Shogun by Trivium, which also came out in September of 2008, but on Roadrunner. I remember when this album came out, and I was just excited that they weren't doing what they were doing on The Crusade, which was their 3rd album. This is their 4th, by the way, and just kind of trying their best to be Metallica light. I was a fan when their 2nd album, Ascendancy, came out, which was more on the metalcore side, and I kind of felt betrayed by that, The Crusade. And then this one, it has elements of both the metalcore and the Metallica thrash thing without feeling really like either. I think the main thing about this album that set it apart was Matt Heafy's embracing of his Japanese background. That was both lyrically and musically. The Japanese musical influences are subtle. This doesn't sound like Trivium doing a Japanese folk metal album. It's just the riffs have a little bit of that flavor. For example, the opening song on the album really embodies sonically that cultural and the military theme of it, with its building percussion, which then translate into, again, to these ears, a slight Japanese mood-setting riff before it goes full-on thrash. And it's interesting to me that when the band stopped trying to be Metallica and just allowed their Metallica influence to seep in, they were better at it. Back when this album came out, it is exactly what I, and I think the metal community at large, wanted from Trivium. I remember seeing the band on this tour. That's how into them I was. And even looking back on it, I had a little bit of like those rose-colored glasses where I'm like, yeah, that album really stands up as exactly what I want that band to be. But the album in some ways does sound a little bit dated. All that being said, 2008 Brad would have given this a higher score, but 2008 Brad was working at Tim Hortons, not at Banger. So 2018 Brad is here to give this a score, and I'm gonna go with 3.5 skulls. Coming in the middle of this review, we've got number 3, Obzen by Meshuggah, out in March of 2008 on Nuclear Blast Records. So I've always respected Meshuggah. I've always understood the appeal of Meshuggah. I've never gotten really in to Meshuggah, apparently until now. I liked Chaos Sphere. I liked some of their earlier stuff where it was a little bit more thrashy, but also had the groove part. But when they settled into their groovy phase, I was like, this kind of gets monotonous, as much as I respected the talent behind it. What they really needed to do with this album, all they really needed was a good sounding album and the key defining traits of Meshuggah, which they delivered. Right off the bat, you've got the opening song, Combustion, which has some of that thrash influence back from Chaos Sphere. It's thick and pulsating, which is something that they also include on Pravis later on in the album. And you don't need a lot of this like faster forward motion in an album, but it is nice to kind of break things up. And of course, we have to talk about Bleed, which is the quintessential Meshuggah song. If they ever didn't play that song live, then I think there would be a riot. I've heard that song so many times that I'm kind of over it, but you have to remove that and remember what a big deal that song was and how it affected everything. There was just such a unique drum groove to this where it maintained their how am I gonna say this? Because I don't know time signatures, but like since their music is so weird, I always just assumed it was in some fucking dumbass time signature.
It's all in 4/4 time, right? But that's the trick with like Meshuggah, is that they'll add so many different elements of like polyrhythms that it sounds like it's in complex time when really it's just in 4/4. So when you do Bleed, it's like
Time signatures. Got it.
Every drummer basically on YouTube tried to cover this and failed miserably. And it really took until Thomas to go, okay, you really want to know how to play this? I will show you how to play this. And then every drummer goes, oh, it's like that. Wait a minute, say that again? I have no idea what you meant by that. So
wait, did you ever cover this on YouTube? So now I understand time signatures a bit more since a drummer explained them to me, but you don't even really need to understand time signatures to understand what a huge impact this album had on the metal world. Do you think it's a coincidence that just 2 years later Periphery put out their debut album and that whole Degent thing kind of blew up? No, this album really exposed Meshuggah and as a whole this more polyrhythmic, groovy side of metal to a bigger audience. And I think that speaks to the importance of the album as a whole. So as both a perfect encapsulation of a moment in time and a defining album in the history of metal and where things would go, I've got to give this a perfect score. Obzen, Meshuggah, 5 out of 5 skulls. Never thought I would say that. Number 2 metal album of 2008, as voted by you, Watershed by Opeth, out in May on Roadrunner Records. Opeth is a band that has always escaped me. Not because I dislike them, in fact, I've always quite liked what I've heard from them, but just because of the sheer enormity of their discography. I'm always like, how am I gonna tackle this band that has like double digits albums? Where do I start? How am I ever gonna have the time to take this all in? So thank you for voting this in. So I kind of had to do that. I had to listen to it. And by the way, I think Michael Ackerfeld has one of the best death growls ever. It's so deep and guttural and threatening, but he's so good at enunciating. So I'm really glad that this album still has some of that. This is their first album with Martin Axelrod on drums and Frederick Akesson on guitar, and I think the metal parts, quite frankly, really do shine because of, in part, thanks to these guys. That being said, I do feel that the metal parts are a little bit more removed from the sound than they have been in the past. It almost seems like the band was less concerned with weaving it all together and more interested in just making the individual parts hit hard. The third track on the album, The Lotus Eater, exemplifies that seesaw between the death metal and the prog side, with the band going back and forth and not necessarily caring about the conventions or the fusion as well. So you've got the blast beats with the clean singing over it, and then it goes into like a super double bass heavy part with growling over it. It's an unconventional use of those elements, but it works. The metal parts are really metal, and the parts that aren't really metal are just really weird. While it's really weird, it somehow works. This weird pulling in opposite directions where the band spent the majority of their career kind of trying to fuse together just works, and it almost feels like a celebration of everything that they've done. Hindsight is 2020. As such, I think it's a fitting swan song to the band's era as a hyper progressive death metal influenced monolith of a band. So with that said, I'm gonna give this album 3.5 skulls out of 5. And I'm gonna continue listening to Opeth because this band is really fucking cool. So we made it. The #1 album of 2008 as chosen by you. You gotta wait for a second here to build the suspense. Cue the Jeopardy theme song. Okay, it's The Way of All Flesh by Gojira, out in October of 2008 on Listenable and Prosthetic Records.
I focus on the present, concentrate on what I find, accelerate the vision, I beyond the curse of time, bring light to my attention, the walls of vacuum fall, this forest increases and tells me where to go.
So with this album, Gojira had the near impossible task of following up the perfection that is From Mars to Sirius. And I really had no idea how they could pull that off. This album is the sound of a band pushing to break free from any constraints that are, of course, self-imposed. They are moving steadily away from the death metal. While still there are certainly still a lot of death metal elements, it focuses more on the groove than the discordant death metal thing. That's shown through the opener Ouroboros and the song later in the album, Vacuity, which coincidentally they bookended their set with the first time that I saw them. And that kind of sound stuck in my head as like the defining sound of this album. You know what this band likes? They like the pick scrapes. They love going, and I fucking love that shit. That shit's cool. The second song, Toxic Garbage Island, which continues the enviro metal thing that they had going on. While most of this album deals with death lyrically. And when they do that more dissonant kind of thing, it kind of shakes you out of that almost trance they get you in with their groovier parts. You know, that opening riff to Ouroboros, it's just tapping, and it continues to build on itself and build on itself and build on itself, and then repeat and then repeat and then repeat. And if I were to have a problem with this album, it would be that some of the riffs kind of repeat themselves into the ground. So while at the time of this album coming out, it felt like the perfect follow-up to From Mars to Sirius, I never expected them to top this with L'Enfant Sauvage. That being said, we're talking a trio of albums here that are all phenomenal in their own right. So while this is not my favorite of those three, it's still a really good album. So I'm gonna give this album 4 out of 5 skulls. And for those of you who are worried about their latest one, you know, going way more mainstream and kind of breaking up with their death metal side, I think the fact that this in-between album was the embryo from which L'Enfant grew will prove that the next album is going to be an absolute monster. And when that album comes out, you can watch this review and I'm going to say, told you so. So 2008 was clearly a great year for progressive metal. And rounding out the top 10 for albums that you guys voted that got close but no cigar, we have Testament, The Formation of Damnation. We have Metallica, Death Magnetic, Slipknot, All Hope Is Gone, Enslaved, Vertebrae, and Protest the Heroes, Fortress. All fine choices, but not my choices. I'm going to tell you a few of my personal favorite albums of the year, which I would have loved to have reviewed here. We've got Cursed, 3, The Architects of Troubled Sleep. Winds of Plagues, Decimate the Weak. Bleeding Through's Declaration. Bloodbath put out fucking 3 releases this year, so I got more of Michael Ackerfeld's Death Growl. There was a lot of good music that wasn't just in the progressive realm. I liked that year. So, thanks for being a part of this and voting for Overkill Rewind. This is the end of this segment of Overkill Rewind, but we're gonna keep doing these, so maybe I'll see you here again. So subscribe so you don't miss that or anything else, because when we're here, magic happens.